Hi, everybody. I'm Bibi from the International Society for the Comparative Study of Civilizations. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Hilton Root, an esteemed political economist and expert in public policy. Dr. Root is a professor at George Mason University and has published extensively on governance and institutions shaping economic outcomes. Today, we'll be diving into his forthcoming book, Divided Destiny, which explores the evolution of civilizations and their impact on today's global governance. Welcome, Hilton. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Is there anything you would like to add about yourself before we move on?
Well, thank you, Bibi, for the generous introduction. Yeah, I would like to say that the fact that we're here, sitting here today, talking about cultural evolution, civilizations, morality, and in the context of global political economy, and even in the context of current events, would have been very surprising to me 20 years ago, and I think to most of us, when we thought we knew where the destiny of humanity was headed, and we all believed it was headed in a direction captured by the Fukuyama phrase, the end of history, the tendency of progress to drive all countries, regardless of their cultural variations or backgrounds or legacies, towards the same destiny, a destiny shaped by liberal markets and liberal political institutions. But today, it's pretty clear that we were mistaken. I was mistaken. Many people were mistaken. And today we see that the destiny of humanity is divided by societies that see themselves as civilizations and societies that see themselves as constrained by the rules of modern statecraft, including the constraints on government and theater of definitions and priority given to human rights and the development of individual human capacity. So that division is extremely stark at this moment, and it's trying to understand the institutional and cultural underpinnings of this divided destiny that I wrote this book. And of course, I draw on much of my knowledge, both experiential knowledge as a policy analyst and sometimes consultant for government and international agencies, but also my background, both in economic history and in economics more generally. But what's new is that I had to learn quite a bit about moral philosophy. And it's so much so that one of my old friends asked me, "Have you become a moral philosopher?" And I don't know that there's an answer for that, because I'm not sure anyone knows what that means. But I think it's more general that morality is now really a driving concern that puts different perspectives on events and consequences and goals and notions of the future and ideals for future development. So that's why I wrote this book.
In the book, which thank you, you gave me a sneak peek to read before this interview, you discuss the coevolution in culture and civilization, and you start by explaining the difference between the two. So can you please share with us your definition here? What is culture and what is civilization, as there is a tendency to mix up the two?
Well, thank you for that question. So I've been asked that question by many readers of the book. And so my definition, which I don't think is extremely original, is that culture typically refers to shared beliefs, values, norms, customs, arts, history, folklore of a group. So it encompasses both the tangible and intangible aspects that shape the way individuals think, the way they behave, and the way they interact. And it's observable in everyday life through language, through religion, through cuisine, through social habits, and of course the arts. So it's a collection of ideas and practices that govern individual behavior. And it's also the relationship of norms and societal attitudes. to individuals. So it's about how they form a collective ethos. But civilization, on the other hand, includes the creation and maintenance of complex social structures, such as cities and governmental systems and professional specializations, advanced forms of economic exchanges, infrastructure, things like the stock market. And these operate at a societal or a state level and encompass legal, economic, and political organization. So obviously culture and civilization interact, but I think they are distinct. Culture feeds into the fabric of a civilization, and civilization enables the further development and the propagation of cultural norms or behaviors. And so what I've tried to do is to look at the cultural evolution of both China and the West, using whatever theories are available, both through economics and I've gone even to organizational theory, sociology. They're all different concepts, but the ones I found most useful is the notion of isomorphism, which is in organizational theory, and then underpinning or driving isomorphism is the cognition and the difference between individualized and collectivist forms of social organization. So what I define here, is cultural cognitive isomorphism. This is the driving term in the study.
I found it very interesting, this term isomorphism, and that there are different forms of it, which you mentioned in the book. Can you elaborate a bit about these different forms?
Yeah, so probably the most commonly acknowledged form is mimetic, in other words, imitation. The fact that institutions tend to copy already existing models. They do this for purposes of legitimacy. So if there's a successful model, then if we want to become successful, we copy what's already there. So I remember when I was at Stanford a while back, Stanford aspired to be recognized as a top-tier university. So what it did is it imitated criteria behavior from Harvard. And one of the ways it did this is to try to invite people from the board of Harvard to join the board of Stanford. And this resulted in a isomorphic replication of many of the values from the Harvard environment into the Stanford environment. And it was a cultural change that many of us experienced. So that's a form of isomorphism. I bring that up because it's in my own personal experience. I'm sure many people have. I experienced the same thing here when I came to George Mason to teach. We had a school of public policy. It was very unique, and it was a hybrid. It didn't resemble anything in the world, anything anywhere else. And that's one of the reasons why I was excited to join it. It was very similar to, it emerged from basically interacting with the Washington community. So it was a very homegrown, grassroots kind of place, but it was eccentric. Well, a dean came, a provost, I should say, from another institution, a science-based institution with no background in ours. And the first thing he did is he said, I don't understand what this thing is. They're a school of public policy. It's not common. It doesn't reflect anything I'm familiar with. So he immediately changed it and reorganized and blended us with the political science department. And he did this because he said, a lot of schools have something like a government and policy department or program or school. So why don't we just create that here? So we went from being something eccentric and interesting and hybrid to something, more or less replicating what every other school in the region had. And of course, in the process, we lost our identity. But this was driven by the desire to to legitimize us and to make us more akin to supposedly successful models. So this kind of instinct I'm sure everyone who's listening to this has experienced this in one way or another, can also be found in cultures. One of the driving forces of the changes that occurred in China after Deng Xiaoping came to power was imitation of Western forms of organization, and including more market-oriented economic institutions and policies. So this was driven by admiration, but fear of, and a desire for legitimacy, but also it was mostly mimicking what was there, but in a obviously Chinese framework. So when I looked at the larger picture, what emerged, the term that really became important to me was cultural cognitive isomorphism. This was the type of isomorphism that I really wanted to understand. Now, I'll just say one other thing. What's interesting about the concept of isomorphism, which appealed to me, is that economists generally tend to see institutions as rational constructs, as efficiency-driven constructs. They see them as driven by some kind of rational cost-benefit calculation. But the term isomorphism comes from a different framework, which emphasizes the societal impulses that lead to isomorphic tendencies. So it's a very different approach. It emphasizes the embeddedness of institutions in social frameworks, in social context. And so this makes the study of institutions from an isomorphic context very different than the way organizations were understood and their evolution in economics.
It's a very interesting term. I am actually have for many years also been in business, and reading about isomorphism, I was thinking, wow, this is fully applicable to, for example, people who are building startups or who are in organizations and want to change or look how to develop that organization. So I think it's really a very wide spectrum. I think it applies to all organizations, no matter the field. What do you think?
I absolutely agree with you. It's a behavioral characteristic. It's a societal characteristic, and it drives a lot of the organizational developments, and especially in business. Many businesses completely model themselves on another business model of a successful firm in the field that they want to either enter or rival. Now, this is understandable because it gives them legitimacy and therefore more potential appeal to investors who are looking for something they're familiar with. But it also undermines innovation. It undermines originality, autonomy, independence. And so to some extent, institutional isomorphism is something we need to be somewhat vigilant about, because it undermines the creative impulses, and it undermines the bottom-up genesis of institutional frameworks. So yes, I think it's a very prevalent pattern of behavior in organizations, and it explains a lot of the decisions that leaders make. It's not necessarily something we want to imitate, though. It's not something that it's not necessarily a good thing. So, for example, in my own professional background, the two cases of imitative mimetic isomorphism that subjected both Stanford and my School of Public Policy to become more alike what already existed out there, in my opinion, had a negative impact on the creativity and uniqueness of those institutions. But on the other hand, from an administrator's point of view, it gave these institutions more legitimacy. And it gave the administrators credit, because they could say, look what I did. I took this messy thing and I created a formal structure. I did the right thing. And then who benefited from this? Well, the administrators benefited because they became very prominent. Our provost became the president of a university. The same thing happened At Stanford, the individuals involved with this transformation are very proud of themselves. Harvard and Stanford are now on the same, wavelength. Stanford now considers itself a peer, and so people give a lot of credit to the administrators who brought this about. So there are different perspectives on why this happens, but I just thought this would be a very useful framework, a way to frame institutional development in my book, because it captured something universalistic, just as you've said, but it also captured a way of looking at institutions that differed from the conventional view. And there was nothing wrong with the conventional view, except that it didn't account for this societal tendency of mimicry. And it didn't account for the degree of embeddedness of institutions in societal and cultural and civilizational contexts. So that's why I developed this theme in the book. And so I'm hoping that my colleagues in economics who read this book will see this as an innovative and useful insight that I'm providing about organizational development and long-term change.
I'm sure, because this is what our organizations across different fields, they face situations when they are stuck, as you said, that the implementation of isomorphism may lead to innovation and more, I guess, creativity and moving the organization forward. So I really think it's for me, it was a discovery. So so I hope also for our viewers,
yeah, I'm very happy to
do the
hear
same.
that. I'm hoping others will also find it as a discovery, because it was for me.
Mm-hmm.
Because I had been familiar with this literature. The most important article or foundational article was written by Paul DiMaggio and Walter Powell in 1983. It had been very widely disseminated among organizational theorists in business areas. You mentioned it's fundamental sociologists, but it had not really crossed over into economics. So we'll see. We'll see how receptive economists are to this concept.
Well, another very strong point that you make in the chapters in your book, and what I'd like to discuss now, and I think also will be very interesting for people to hear about, is the individualism versus collectivism. So you draw a contrast between Western individualism and Chinese collectivism. So can you share with us more thoughts on this?
Yes. So for this, I'm very much indebted and beholden to cultural psychologists or cognitive psychologists. There have been a number of, I think, really important studies in that field that indicate that there's some kind of consistency to an individualistic ethos and a collectivist ethos. And in one, there's an emphasis on the independence of the individual, and the other, the interdependence. And based on some very important studies that were introduced to me, about 10 or 12 years ago, it's clear that these are distinctive tendencies, and that once you go down one path, one of these paths, and you acquire habits and norms and values that are predicated around, let's say, individualistic versus communalistic or collectivist values, that you're gonna stay on that path. There isn't a lot of crossover, and basically the issue is how much autonomy does the individual have in relationship to the community? And societies and cultures come down very differently on this. And China has very strong preferences with regard to the collectivist individualist trade-off that are at sharp variance with those of Western societies, particularly due, in my opinion, to the role of Christian theology and its institutional and cultural influence over time on the West. it has no analogy to any religious form of expression that occurred in the Semitic world, and so these different behavioral patterns are deeply entrenched. Now, cultural psychologists who study this, they observe the consistency, but they don't really attribute it to a cause. They just accept it as a given because it's consistent in the behavior they observe. In my book, what I tried to do is to relate it to the historical, institutional, cultural legacies, particularly of the different religions that were prevalent in China and in the West. So that I add a dimension to the thinking of cognitive theorists, cognitive psychologists, by linking the cultural differences and consistencies that they observe to the historical patterns of religious observance and ritual and the enforcement of that over time, the institutionalization of that over time. So that's how this book developed. It started out by. So then the other thing I did is I also studied cultural evolution theorists in anthropology, and found that they were also had important wisdom to bring to bear on the collective versus individualistic patterns of societal development, and they also observed deeply entrenched historical patterns where once these tendencies start to diverge, they don't seem to ever reconverge. Now, this has tremendous implications for global governance, for human rights, for differences about the role of democracy, definition of democracy, definition of the responsibility of the individual to society, etc.
You mentioned now a hinge of history. You start a chapter actually about it. And are we now, can you explain the term so that our viewers understand what exactly is that moment? And are we there?
So I noticed a number of people were using this phrase hinge moment.
Mhm.
And a hinge moment implies you can swing both ways. It doesn't imply there's a deterministic direction to history, as did the Fukuyama liberal progressive notion that you're going in one direction and everybody's moving in the same direction. So the hinge notion was and what appealed to me about it is that the hinge could open on different sides of the door frame, right? You can go in different directions, and it didn't preclude the notion that you could go in completely different directions. So some societies faced with the technological advantages and challenges of the 21st century could use these to create their own hinge moment based on their own cultural identities and their own cultural beliefs, and that this could be very different from the hinge moment that we foresee. So if you look at technology, you see the enormous impact of technology on society, but how different societies seek to use that technology really depends on their conception of the future they desire and the hinge moment that they desire. And so that's why I thought this term was more useful than the notion of every society moving in the same direction. So we all realized that we were at a transitional time in human history, but whether that would be what kind of tipping point that would be, whether that would be a hinge, I thought it was a useful metaphor. So I developed it in the book. But the real purpose of it is just to indicate that when societies think about the idealized future that they aspire to, their notions of what that should be are based on historical and cultural and moral predilections that are already deeply embedded in their fabric, in their cultural fabric. And therefore they come up with very different notions of what this hinge means. So for example, in the Western world, we think of the hinge as everyone moving towards a liberal democratic outcome. And for the Chinese, they see this as the revival of their status in the world as a great civilization equal to or greater than all others. So they're not moving in the same direction as the West. They're actually viewing their hinge as a bifurcation moment, not as a convergence moment. So that's a fundamentally different way of envisioning the future. And so that's really what this is about, because much of our public policy is about what kind of future we desire for ourselves. And so the intuition here is that when Chinese look to the future and think about what they want for themselves, but also how that positions them in the relationship to the rest of the world, what they bring to bear on that thinking is very different than the values and perspectives that an individualist society would have.
Now, that's very interesting. I think it's important to know the difference so one can understand the behavior then of countries, how they view things different, how they view differently. Because you mentioned in the book that China is a civilizational state, and you also discuss about the difference between the nation versus civilizational state. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
Yep. So there are several people who've referred to China this way, including some of the great China scholars of the past. But what's interesting is that Xi Jinping and the CCP today embrace this notion of China as a civilizational state. And they also embrace the notion of a world divided into civilizational blocks, all equal and all and the Western states are essentially built upon a very different concept, which is that of a state that is constrained by rules and laws and constitutional frameworks, and is constrained rather than promoting an unlimited aspiration, because a civilizational state literally has no boundaries. So if you think about the advocates of this concept, Xi Jinping or the leaders of Iran or Russia that embrace this concept, or even a tiny country like Hungary, they see themselves as having justifiable territorial ambitions based on the fact that people of their ethnicity or their cultural heritage are located in different locations, even though they are located within the states of other, and therefore are actually under different jurisdictions from a purely secular point of view. This is what gave rise to the tensions between Turkey and Western Europe, something I wrote about a number of years ago, an article that was evidently very unpopular. But what I believe that the future of Turkey and Europe needed to have a much stronger alignment, and that Turkey should be allowed to join the EU as a full-fledged member. And I thought this would significantly orient Turkey and consolidate its identification with the West. Many people know that Turkey has been historically defined as a torn state. But Erdogan, the Turkish leader, unfortunately issued a dictate that all Turks, all people of Turkish descent, were ultimately under the jurisdiction of Turkey and of Istanbul. So this completely soured people in France or England, where I presented this paper, on the notion that there could ever be integration, because this violated the fundamental premise of states and in Europe, which is that people are beholden to the rules and laws of their given jurisdiction, and are not to be guided and governed from on the basis of their ethnicity or on their religion by a leader who's in another country. And this distinction is so very clear. And I think it's, obviously what's at stake in the Ukraine conflict. And it should be articulated even more so than it is, because it's very clear if you read any of the ideology that led to the Russian aggression against Ukraine, that it was entirely based on their notion of civilizational identity. And they said, well, those guys in the Ukraine are our civilization. They have the same religion. And so they belong to us, and they shouldn't have their own state. They're under our jurisdiction. That's a very different view of identity than the notion that we have in a constitutionally republic that we think Ukraine aspires to become. And of course, Xi Jinping also uses this civilizational logic to express his rightful claims to Taiwan, even though on a liberal framework, on a liberal constitutional framework, those claims are very weak. But on a civilizational framework, which is they're very strong. But that also gives China civilizational entitlements to have something to say about all of the other countries in Southeast Asia where Chinese populations over time have migrated. And in some countries like Malaysia, Singapore, the Chinese in some cases outnumber the indigenous populations, and they control vast resources. So this is this claim of civilizational autonomy is really confrontational with the values of a Westphalian Western world order or constitutional frame world order. And they are going to lead to perpetual conflict. There's no way that these two visions of societal organization can live together peacefully, because one is basically insinuating that there are rights or justifications for territorial aggression. And this is why one of the chapters in the book is called civilizational fragmentation, or I'm not sure I remember the exact name, but these different views are definitely causing a kind of global fragmentation based on underlying different moral premises upon which the states of these are built. So yes, I see this as deeply problematic. I find this resonates with a lot of other people that I've been talking to, that they are very concerned of this. And if you read what is produced on this topic, both by Xi Jinping, which is extensive, they now have a textbook, which is now going to be used for civic education in all of Chinese schools, that basically frames China's role in the world as a civilization. And of course, many of the intellectual leaders of Putin's aggression have the same framework in their minds, the same motive, and it motivates the kind of aggressive conflicts with the West. And so this to me is really what the conflict and crisis in the Ukraine is about. It's about two different visions of order, of societal, political, and cultural order, and therefore I don't think these conflicts are going to go away anytime soon. You see, because the intellectual underpinnings are so strong, and I think people need to be educated on this. And this is another reason why I wrote the book. And a lot of people say to me, "You don't want the Chinese U.S. conflict, trade war, what started as a trade war, to become to become civilizational. No, of course we don't want that, but we can't avoid that once that happens. And I think that's where we are right now, that the terms of this dispute have quickly become civilizational in this very precise way that I've tried to define it in the book. And I've tried to give this discussion a great deal of precision by what I mean by a civilizational state. And of course, I could show you hundreds of pages of text produced by various intellectuals working for the Communist Party under Xi Jinping that have articulated this. And they've done so through communication with Russian thinkers. You can actually, there are actually websites that very few people look at that are actually in English, in which you can see the integration of Chinese and Russian thinking on this, and how challenging this would be to, fundamentally challenging to a so-called Western-led world order.
Yeah, this is very interesting, and as you said, very concerning. In your opinion, what does the West need to maybe change its approach, or is the approach right? Or how do you see, for example, what can the West do to counter the civilizational state?
Well, so that's a much harder question. I think you have to start from the premise that you want to avoid worst case scenarios and move from there incrementally towards those areas where we can agree to cooperate. But I don't think you can start from the notion that cooperation is the norm, and then the extreme or outlier is a conflict. I think you have to look at conflict as being the norm, and then from there work your way towards some forms of reconciliation. So when we think about what a reconciliation would look like, the best place to look is in East Asia. As you may know, I did a lot of my early research on the rise of East Asia and the institutional basis of East Asia's economic success. But also, East Asia is where you have collectivist, basically Sinitic Confucian originated societies that have embraced democracy. And they have shown, as Taiwan is showing, which is why Taiwan is so important. It's a small country. But that's why I wrote this book called Small Countries, Big Lessons many years ago. It has a gigantic lesson for the Chinese in particular, which is that you can still be very Chinese. You can still be very Confucian. You can still have you can still believe in all of the collective kin-based values, religious beliefs that are of Chinese origin, and still be a functioning democracy, and still have some, well, I should say, still recognize the autonomy and the of human rights, the same way it's written in the Human Rights Convention of the United Nations. But so a reconciliation is possible, and we actually have an example of what that would look like in the world today. Japan is another example, and South Korea is an example. But these are very tenuous, very delicate examples, and they can easily be crushed. And they're very vulnerable because physically look at the part of the world that they're in. They're right next to China and Russia. So then the question becomes, what kind of security arrangements is needed to ensure that these type of societies will be allowed to flourish in what is basically a very hostile part of the world from a political, institutional, from a international relations point of view. These are very vulnerable countries, Australia as well, New Zealand, the Philippines, etc.
Well, this is a lot of food for thought. Hilton, when is your book going to come out?
I wish I could tell you it's going to come out tomorrow because it's already written, but it's in the hands of readers, reviewers for academic press, and this process uh, tends to be very slow. Um, I think optimistically, I think it will take a year if everything goes smoothly, because there'll be readers' reports, then there'll have to be the board of the press agreeing to publish it, and then the actual process of publishing it, getting into catalogs and getting it out. So to be optimistic, it could be a year, but it could easily be longer than that. That's the problem of being in the academic world and not being in the trade world and not working with commercial publishers. But unfortunately, I don't know how to put a book like this out in a trade book format, not only because of my own background, but just because the ideas are so beholden to frameworks of thinking that have been evolved in various academic disciplines and require a certain degree of scientific knowledge, and even to some extent even a technical knowledge. The terminologies, for example, like some of the ones you mentioned, isomorphism, but then even culture and civilization are terms that are, in the general populace, very vague. And as you said, for most people, the difference is they don't know that, they don't observe a difference.
Mm.
They realize that these are fundamentally different concepts, though they're interactive and coevolutionary, but they're different. So hopefully, through engagement, like conversations that we're having, it will be possible to present these ideas in a more commercially accessible way and a more popularly accessible way, and maybe can even influence education at the undergraduate or high school level. Uh, I hope that I'll be involved in that as these ideas percolate, and your organization is obviously dedicated to this kind of thinking, and I am delighted actually to have made contact with you on this topic. There are people who really care about this. They're spread around the world, and a lot of them happen to be in China and Russia and in Turkey and in Hungary. They're in places where they're thinking about these things, but they're very differently from the way we in the English language world are thinking about them. So there's a lot of room for dialogue. I wish there could be more dialogue on this. I'm hoping the book will be translated into Russian and Chinese. In that case, it will help significantly have a cross-cultural, cross-civilizational dialogue on this. That's my hope. And there's only so much anyone can do. So, what I do best is writing books. There are other skills that other people have that can help to promote these ideas.
Yes, it's necessary to talk, discuss, and also first of all, bring awareness. Because lately, in the last year or two, more and more people that I encounter, even those that are not in the academic world, are mentioning, oh, it's a civilizational thing. But whether this is just a statement on the surface or is it deeper, well, it depends from the person. But this makes me think, yes, this is something that we should discuss. Also discuss the differences, and then, as you said, it could lead to a path of dialogue, and hopefully then some kind of cooperation. But first of all, knowledge is important, as exactly what we were discussing today, as you mentioned, the difference only between culture, civilization, between nation state, civilizational states. And then things become more clear that why conflicts are today.
So we're at the very early stage of this. So I bet if you were to look at the international relations textbooks that are on my shelf here, and I haven't opened them in years, none of them would mention civilizational conflict. none of them would would have recognized the inherent conflict between nation and civilizational states. Uh, so we're at a very early stage of introducing awareness on these concepts, and we're also at a very early stage of developing the analytical tools and clarity we need to articulate this to a wider audience. But I'm very optimistic that, as you said, more and more people are seeing this. And my concern is that the people who are seeing this are not the people in the West. They're much more the people in places like Hungary and Turkey, where they aspire to reconstruct their civilizational identity based on historical sense of wrong and historical epochs in which they were great, and so they come at this with a sense of grievance, and that's where you have something that's deeply problematic. So the most interesting laboratory for this would be India. Why? Because India conceives of itself both as a civilizational state, but also as a constitutionally mandated and constitutionally constructed state. So, of course, if you have the BJP party, it's more on the civilizational side, identifies India, let's say, more with a religion, with Hinduism, and with implicit normative values that are, religious. On the other hand, the Congress Party and many Western educated Indian leaders have seen India's destiny or future in terms of its embracing the rule-bound constitutional order illustrated by India's Supreme Court, which has survived all of these battles to still have a very formative influence on India's democracy and cohesion as a society. But whether that cohesion will be based on the premises of a rule-bound system, a constitutional India, or whether it will become a civilizational India, is really up for grabs right now. It's an interesting place to observe, because this issue is very prevalent, but also causing, I would say, enormous polarization within India. But it's a very real debate in India as to what their underlying identity is, and how they want to face the world. Do they want to face the world as a civilization, a Hindu civilization, or do they want to face the world as a great constitutional democracy in a third world setting as a model to other third world countries? Now, there was a time when the Congress Party had that greater vision, and that's sort of faded. And India really hasn't emerged as a leader of the so-called, global South, and it has allowed China to take that mantle. And this is also, in many ways, unfortunate, and hopefully that will change. If India can become more representative of the possibilities of the global South to progress economically, but also to progress constitutionally, then India can eventually become the beacon for these countries rather than China. Now, China's trying very strongly to play that role through the spread of its technology, through digitalization, and through creating ties of dependency, technological dependency. And India clearly doesn't have the ability, the capacity technologically to be the leader of anything. But it does have a moral high ground in that it has defended democracy. It has been a consistent democracy since its creation, and it has not given rise to any kind of a military takeover or one-party state system. So in terms of moral authority, India has great moral authority in the world, but what does that mean, and how are they going to project that? It's also a very important subject for the future of humanity, and it concerns us as well because we have a lot at stake here. If India can only succeed as a thriving, prosperous, constitutional entity, but in dealing with the problems of development successfully, then India could really be a model of an alternative to civilizational conflict.
Well, fascinating actually example. So I guess the future will tell us how that will then unfold. Well, Hilton, I'd like to thank you.
It's not the future, it's in our power. It's in our grasp.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a question of uncontrollable trends that are out there. It's really within our power to make this happen. And that has to come from strong ideological moral clarity, which we don't have right now. But that's where it has to start. And it's not just having a blind faith that something good will happen, because something bad can equally happen. We have to be in control, and we're not. And that's my concern right now. When I say control, I don't mean control in a power sense. We have to have a clear sense of who we are. We have to know who we are before we can go out and speak to others. And so we have to have a very clear we have to have moral clarity. And we don't have that at this point. And that's what this book is about.
Mm-hmm.
It's about helping us and others, including people in China and Russia who may read this book, achieve moral clarity and understand the consequences of the positions that they have taken.
For us in the society, we are doing our share and of explaining, then also developing the understanding of who we are, what we stand for, and what are our moral and ethical high grounds, if we could put it that way.
Well, you people are doing great work, and I'm thrilled to have had this interview and contact with you, and I hope that we continue to dialogue and to pursue our common interests.
Wonderfully said. Thank you. Well, thank you, Hilton, so much for sharing your insights with us today. There's, I think, a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure, first of all, that I will be thinking a lot about our talk and everything that we've discussed. So, and to everyone who's watching, I highly recommend that we keep an eye on Dr. Root's forthcoming book, and then we'll invite Dr. Root to talk to us again then.
Well, thank you so much, and have a great, for you it's evening, and for me it's lunchtime.
Lunchtime. Well, have a nice day then. Bye-bye.